Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the incoming fire. "Move, move, move," he shouted, pushing his squad mates out of the way. He barely had time to react as a plasma shell tore through the air, crashing into the ground right where he had been standing just seconds before. He was thrown back, his body slamming against a nearby wall. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Ethan could barely make out his comrades, now scattered, struggling to regroup. He pushed himself up, his head spinning, the world around him slowly coming back into focus. His exosuit, designed for heavy combat, was intact, but his helmet's communication system was damaged. His ears rang, and all he could hear was the crackling of the communication line. The alien fleet didn't pause for a second. Their eye-driven strategy was cold, calculated, and relentless. There was no room for mercy, and the humans were simply an obstacle to be cleared. Ethan's squad was too small to make a difference, and the alien forces were overwhelming. Bonner, back in the command center, had witnessed the devastation unfold. The strategic strikes on the outer defenses were not accidental. The AI knew exactly how to dismantle the human forces. With their first line of defense shattered, the aliens advanced, and Bonner knew the situation was dire. He slammed his fist on the console, frustration and anger mixing in his eyes. "We can't just sit here and wait for our forces to be wiped out. We need to strike back now." One of the officers, Lieutenant Harris, looked up at Bonner. "General, our forces are being overrun. We need to fall back to secondary positions, or we'll lose everything." Bonner clenched his jaw, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He couldn't allow his people to die without a fight. Private Cole, though injured, had survived the initial onslaught. He was out there somewhere, fighting to stay alive, just like everyone else. Bonner's mind raced. He had to find a way to win this. He had to make the aliens pay. Ethan's voice came through on the radio, crackling through the interference. "General, we can't lose. We have to fight back." His words echoed in Bonner's mind. Despite the odds, despite the overwhelming power of the alien fleet, the humans refused to back down. They had lost too much, and now was the time to take the fight to the enemy. Bonner steadied himself. His soldiers were counting on him. He couldn't let them fall. "We may be outgunned, but we are not outmatched," he declared, his voice filled with determination. "Get ready for counterattacks. It's not over. Not yet." The camera zoomed in on Bonner's face, his eyes burning with resolve. He knew that this would be the fight of his life. The humans had no choice but to face this alien threat head-on. They had no more options. The only way to survive was to strike back with everything they had. The battle for Arcadia 5 had only just begun, and the aliens would soon learn that humans never surrendered. This was just the beginning. The battlefield above Arcadia 5 was chaos, with explosions lighting up the dark expanse of space. The alien warships, massive and imposing, tore through the planet's outer defense systems like they were nothing more than paper. Their cloaking technology made them nearly invisible to the human radar, and their advanced weaponry wiped out entire sections of the colony's defensive grid in seconds. It was as if the fate of the colony had already been sealed. But despite the overwhelming odds, the humans weren't ready to surrender. Not yet. Inside the human command center, General Bonner watched in silence as his forces fought back with everything they had. The outer defenses were crumbling, but the humans weren't done. Not by a long shot. Bonner's fingers danced across the console, coordinating the last-ditch efforts to fight back. "Activate the stealth fighters," he ordered, his voice steady but urgent. "It's our only chance." His orders were swift and deliberate. The human resistance had one weapon the aliens didn't anticipate: cloaking stealth fighters. These sleek, advanced ships could hide in plain sight, making them nearly impossible for the AI-driven alien warships to track. The human fleet had designed them as a desperate countermeasure, an answer to the overwhelming strength of the alien invaders. It wasn't much, but it was something. And right now, That was all they had. Lieutenant Ethan Kane's boots crunched against the gravel as he trudged through the ruins of the alien world. His mission had been simple: find the enemy base, gather intel, and get out. But things rarely went according to plan, especially when the war dragged on as long as this one had. He wasn't even sure how he'd ended up on this planet, a forgotten stretch of dirt and debris in the middle of a hostile galaxy. All he knew was that his orders had shifted, and now he was left stranded, with no way to communicate with his fleet. The sky above him was an eerie shade of purple, the sun dimmed behind a thick layer of clouds. Ethan's helmet provided a clear view of his surroundings, a desolate landscape littered with the wreckage of ships, some human, some not. The battle had been fierce here, and it had left a scar on the planet, much like it had done to Ethan's soul. His armor was scratched and worn, blood from his wounds seeping into the fabric. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. It was then that he saw her. At first, Ethan thought it was an illusion, his eyes playing tricks on him from exhaustion. A flash of movement, a silhouette among the twisted metal of a destroyed ship. As he squinted, he realized it was a figure, a woman, or something that looked like a woman. Her skin shimmered, almost like liquid opal, glowing faintly even in the dim light of the sky. Her body was slim, almost delicate, and her long dark hair flowed around her like it was being moved by an invisible wind. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were unlike any human's. They were large, black, and endless, filled with a strange intelligence that seemed to pierce straight through him. The moment their eyes met, Ethan felt a jolt of something he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even curiosity. It was connection. A deep, strange pull that he couldn't ignore. Ethan stepped closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon on his hip, though he had no intention of using it. The woman was injured. She lay on the ground, crumpled beneath the twisted remnants of what appeared to be a small spacecraft. Blood, bright, almost glowing blood, was spilling from a deep gash in her side. It pooled around her, staining the ground beneath her. She was dying. "Hold on," Ethan muttered to himself, snapping out of his trance. He looked around, seeing no signs of enemy patrols, but the silence was unnerving. He knelt beside her, his heart racing. She was an alien. That much was obvious, but there was something about her fragility that made her seem human in a way. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, a look that seemed both filled with fear and desperation. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. Her lips parted, and she made a sound, but it wasn't English. It was a soft, melodic series of tones that felt more like music than speech. Ethan didn't understand, but he felt the weight of her gaze, the pain in it. He knew what he had to do. "Stay still," he told her gently, though his hands were shaking. His first instinct was to check his own wounds, but he realized that wasn't important right now. Not when someone needed help. Ethan quickly pulled off his gloves and examined her injuries, trying to assess what he was working with. Her breathing was shallow, labored. She wasn't going to last much longer if he didn't act. His eyes flickered to the side, where his survival pack lay. There was a basic first aid kit in there, nothing too advanced, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed the kit and rummaged through it, but there was no way he could patch her up with just bandages and antiseptic. Her injuries were far worse than that. His gaze turned back to her, and for the briefest moment, he hesitated. He didn't know if it would work. It probably wouldn't. But then again, he didn't have much to lose. "Okay, this is crazy," Ethan muttered, pulling off his own helmet. His next actions happened quickly, driven by the urgency of the moment. He needed to save her, the only way he knew how. He took off his outer suit, revealing his bare arm. He didn't think too much about it, just acted. Ethan placed his wrist to her mouth, hoping for some reaction. Her lips were cold, but there was a flicker of awareness in her eyes. She looked at him, confused and weak, but her gaze never left his. Without thinking twice, Ethan pressed his arm against her wound. The bleeding had slowed but wasn't stopping. His blood, human blood, would be the only thing to help her now. Her expression softened, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of vulnerability in her eyes. "You're not just soldiers, Ethan. You are the one who saved me. I can feel it. The connection between us. My people. We have rituals, ways to bond with those we choose to share our essence with. The blood exchange is a part of that. It is not just physical. It is spiritual, emotional." Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he understood, but he knew one thing. Something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the physical bond. There was something in the air, something in the way her presence filled the cave and wrapped around him, making it hard to focus on anything else. "You're saying that because of my blood, we're bonded," he repeated, his heart racing faster now. "Is that what you're telling me?" Jaira nodded slowly. "Yes, and with that bond comes a responsibility. I cannot repay you with just words, but I can offer you what my people offer to those who share their life force with us. A connection, a gift." Ethan's mind raced. He didn't want to be a part of this. He had his mission. He had his duty. And while saving her had felt like the right thing to do, he never imagined it would lead to this. A bond. A gift. He wasn't sure what to think about any of it. "I didn't do this for some reward," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I did it because I had to. You were dying." Jaira placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch light and warm. "I know, but my people believe in a balance. You gave your blood to save my life, and now we are connected in ways that cannot be undone. I cannot simply walk away from that." Ethan's thoughts swirled. It wasn't just about him and Jaira anymore. It was about something much bigger, something far more complex. He wanted to protest, to tell her that this wasn't what he signed up for. But a part of him, an instinct deep inside him, knew that this was beyond his control. Whatever had happened between them, it was real, and it couldn't be ignored. "I don't know what you want from me, Jaira," Ethan said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "But I'm not ready for this." Her eyes softened further. "I do not ask you to be ready. I only ask that you trust me, Ethan. Trust that I will help you, and that we can face what comes next together. There are things I can teach you, things that can help you survive." The idea of sharing his life, his future, with an alien felt impossible. But looking at Jaira, feeling the pull between them, the connection that had formed without him realizing it, he couldn't deny the truth of her words. There was something undeniable between them. The bond was real, and it wasn't going to go away. "I trust you," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I'll stay, but we take this one step at a time." Jaira nodded, her smile soft but full of understanding. "That is all I ask." The weight of the bond between them didn't just feel physical. It settled deep into Ethan's chest, a constant reminder that something had shifted. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear this wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about saving each other. Something far deeper was happening. And no matter how much he resisted, no matter how many walls he tried to put up, he couldn't deny it. They spent the next few hours in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jaira seemed to understand him in ways no one ever had. She didn't push him for answers. She didn't ask him to do anything beyond what he was ready for. And that meant something. It meant more than he could fully comprehend at that moment. When Ethan finally stood up, his legs still unsteady, Jaira was there beside him, steady and strong. She offered him her hand, not as a gesture of dependence, but as a promise. One that he wasn't sure he was ready to accept, but one that he couldn't refuse either. "You're not alone in this anymore, Ethan," Jaira said softly. "We are connected now, and I will be with you, no matter what happens." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy with uncertainty, but also with something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, They could make it out of this. Together. Ethan had never been one to believe in fate. He wasn't a man who sat around and pondered the grand mysteries of the universe. He was a soldier, plain and simple. His life was about following orders, completing missions, and surviving. But everything had changed since that moment he gave his blood to Jaira. Since then, things had been different. The strange connection between them wasn't something he could ignore anymore. It wasn't just physical, though he had certainly felt the strange energy flowing through his veins when their blood mixed. It was deeper. It was emotional, like an invisible thread tying them together, one he couldn't break no matter how hard he tried. The bond wasn't just in his head, either. He felt it in his chest, a constant, unshakable presence. There were moments when he thought he could almost hear Jaira's thoughts, as if she were speaking to him without words. He could feel her emotions, too, her relief, her fear, her sadness. They weren't just his own anymore. They were hers too. Sometimes, the feelings were so intense it was almost unbearable. Jaira had told him it was a bond of life and spirit, something shared only with those who had offered their essence to each other. She explained it like a sacred pact, something her people considered rare and precious. And as much as Ethan tried to distance himself from the idea, the truth was that he wasn't just connected to her in a physical sense anymore. He was connected to her in every possible way. They had spent the last few days traveling through the alien wilderness, trying to avoid enemy patrols. The planet's terrain was unforgiving. Rocky hills, dense forests, and strange, glowing creatures lurking in the shadows. It was a harsh environment, and their survival depended on staying hidden. But despite the constant danger, there was something oddly peaceful about the time they spent together. Every night, when they set up camp, Jaira would sit across from him, her glowing skin lighting up the dark like a beacon. It wasn't that Ethan didn't feel the pull toward her. He did. He just wasn't ready to face it. He wasn't ready to admit to himself what he was feeling. There was so much at stake. He was a soldier, and soldiers didn't get involved with aliens. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. But no matter how hard he tried to push the feelings away, they kept coming back, stronger each time. One night, as they sat around the campfire, Ethan couldn't help but notice how close they had become. Jaira was always there, her presence as constant as the stars above them. And though she never pushed him, never made him feel like he had to make a decision, Ethan knew that she felt the bond too. He saw it in the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the way her touch lingered just a little longer than necessary. "We need to talk," Jaira said one evening, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet urgency in it that Ethan couldn't ignore. He looked up from the fire, his fingers tracing the edge of his rifle absent-mindedly. "About what?" "About the bond," she said, her gaze steady. "It's growing stronger. I can feel it. And I think you can too." Ethan stiffened at her words. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but she was right. The bond between them was undeniable. "I don't know what you want me to say," he replied, his voice tight. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." Jaira's expression softened. "I know. But it's real, Ethan. And it's not something you can ignore. It's something we'll have to learn to live with, together." Ethan looked away, staring into the flames. He wasn't sure how to respond. The bond wasn't just a connection. It was an intrusion. It was a part of him now, a part he couldn't escape. He felt her emotions even when she didn't speak. He could feel her fear when they encountered enemy patrols, her relief when they found shelter, and her hope, always her hope, when they spoke of escape. "I don't know how to handle this," Ethan admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't expect any of this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Jaira remained silent for a moment, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "I understand. This is not what either of us wanted, but it is what we have, and we can't undo it. The bond is part of us now. The question is, what do we do with it?" Ethan swallowed hard. What could they do with it? He had no answers, and the truth was, he didn't even know where to begin. He had been trained to fight, to survive, but he wasn't trained for this. He wasn't trained to deal with the overwhelming feelings that came with this alien connection. They had infiltrated the mothership before, but now the stakes were higher than ever. As the team breached the outer walls of the alien craft, they were met with fierce resistance. Explosions rang out, followed by the deafening roar of gunfire. Humans fought their way through the narrow corridors, encountering cybernetically enhanced alien soldiers at every turn. These soldiers weren't like any human opponents. They moved like machines, their reflexes too quick, their strength far beyond anything the humans had ever encountered. Cole fought with everything he had, but the cybernetic enemies were unyielding. His rifle cracked with each shot, but the alien soldiers continued to advance, their mechanical enhancements making them nearly impervious to the humans' attacks. It was a nightmare, but the humans pressed on, determined to destroy the alien ship and stop the invasion. In the chaos of the battle, Cole's thoughts drifted to his best friend. Keller had been by his side through every fight, every skirmish. But now, amid the violence and chaos, Cole feared that this might be the last time they would fight together. As the team reached the inner chamber of the mothership, they planted the explosives they had brought along, hoping to destroy the heart of the alien vessel. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only chance they had left. The cybernetic soldiers closed in from all sides, and for a moment, it seemed like the humans were going to be overrun. The battle had shifted from a desperate fight for survival to a brutal close-quarters conflict. But as they triggered the explosives, the plan began to fall apart. The AI-controlled mothership, which had been adapting throughout the battle, unleashed its most devastating counterattack yet. The ship's defenses seemed to evolve in real time, blocking the humans' attempts to destroy it. The aliens had anticipated the humans' moves, countering every tactic they employed. Bonner, watching the battle unfold from the command center, cursed under his breath. He could see that the humans were holding their own, but the alien AI was learning faster than they could adapt. "This isn't good," Bonner muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen. The reality of the situation was sinking in. How could humanity stand a chance against an enemy that was constantly evolving, getting smarter with every move they made? He thought back to his soldiers, the brave men and women who had fought so hard to protect their home. But with every passing minute, the odds grew slimmer. The orbital bombardments from the alien fleet continued to rain down on the colony, leaving it in ruins. The cityscape was now a desolate wasteland, full of crumbling buildings and burning wreckage. The human forces were fighting valiantly, but it seemed as though the final blow was inevitable. Back on the battlefield, Cole and Keller found themselves cornered by the cybernetic soldiers. There was no escape now. Keller was wounded, his chest covered in blood, his face pale. "You have to carry on, Cole," Keller whispered, his voice barely audible. "Promise me, you'll finish this." Tears welled up in Cole's eyes, but he nodded. He would carry on. For Keller, for humanity. "I will," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And with that, Keller closed his eyes, the light fading from his face. The loss was almost too much to bear, but Cole had no time to mourn. The battle raged on, and he fought harder than ever. He had to live up to the promise he had made. With the explosives set, the team made their final stand. The orbital bombardment began again, and the sky above Arcadia 5 erupted in flames as the alien fleet destroyed the surface of the planet. In those final moments, as the explosions rained down, Cole felt the weight of humanity's fight. The stakes had never been higher, and with the colony falling to ruin, all that was left was the fight. The fight to survive. The fight to protect everything they had worked for. The fight to ensure that humanity would never be forgotten, no matter the cost. And as the colony burned, Cole knew that the final battle had only just begun. The war had taken its toll on humanity. The once vibrant colony on Arcadia 5 now lay in ruins, its citizens either dead or scattered across the galaxy. The alien forces, led by an eye-driven fleet, seemed unstoppable. The colony's last line of defense had failed, and the remnants of the human resistance were cornered. But just as it seemed like all hope was lost, something unexpected happened, a flicker of possibility. Gyra leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "I won't force you to accept this, Ethan. But I need you to understand. I am here. I'm here to help you. I'm here to protect you, just as you protected me." Ethan couldn't help but look at her. There was something in her eyes, something so raw and real, that made him want to believe her. Maybe, just maybe, she could be trusted. Maybe this bond wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it could be something more. "I don't want to be alone in this," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Gyra's lips curved into a small smile. "You're not alone." And for the first time in days, Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders lift slightly. The bond between them wasn't just a connection. It was a partnership, one that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few days passed in a blur of motion. More running, more hiding, and more near misses with enemy patrols. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, Ethan felt something shift. The bond between them grew stronger, but so did their trust. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't pretend that Shara wasn't a part of his life now, whether he liked it or not. One evening, after a long day of travel, they found a small, sheltered cave in the hills. It was quiet and isolated, perfect for a night's rest. Gyra set up camp quickly, her movements graceful and efficient. Ethan, on the other hand, was slower, his mind still spinning with the strange emotions swirling inside him. As he sat down by the fire, he found himself glancing at her more often than he should have. She seemed different tonight, more relaxed, more at peace. It was as though the bond had finally begun to settle between them, like a new skin that fit perfectly. Gyra caught his gaze and smiled. "You're thinking too much," Ethan snorted, leaning back against the cave wall. "Isn't that what soldiers do?" "Not always," she replied softly. "Sometimes you have to let go." Ethan didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to. Letting go wasn't something he was good at. He had spent most of his life keeping his emotions locked up tight, buried under the weight of duty and responsibility. But Gyra was right. The bond was forcing him to confront everything he had been avoiding. "Let's just take this one step at a time," Ethan said finally, his voice steady. "I don't know what the future holds, Gyra, but I know one thing for sure. We have each other now." Gyra nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, and that is more than enough." For the first time in days, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. The bond between them was powerful. He could feel it. And despite the confusion and fear, part of him was starting to believe that it might not be such a bad thing after all. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing hour, the bond between Ethan and Gyra grew stronger. At first, Ethan had thought the strange connection would fade, that it would be something temporary, a side effect of the blood exchange. But it wasn't. It wasn't something that could be ignored or dismissed. It was real, and it was there, settling into his very bones. Ethan tried to fight it, tried to focus on his mission and nothing else. But it wasn't that easy. He felt Gyra's presence with him at all times. It was like a soft hum just beneath the surface of his thoughts, her emotions intertwined with his own. If she was happy, he could feel it. If she was afraid, he could feel that too. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when everything was still and the only sound was the rustling of the wind outside their shelter, he could hear her thoughts. Not in words exactly, but in the feeling behind them. It was like they were speaking without speaking, and it was both strange and comforting at the same time. Gyra, for her part, seemed to have no trouble accepting the connection. She didn't seem scared by it, nor did she shy away from it. Instead, she embraced it fully, using it as a way to guide them both. She didn't tell him what to do, but she would share her thoughts with him, sometimes in a soft whisper that he could feel more than hear. It was like she trusted him with the deepest parts of herself, the parts of her that no one else had ever seen. But Ethan couldn't quite let go. He couldn't quite allow himself to believe that this bond, this connection, was something he could fully accept. He was still a soldier, and soldiers didn't have the luxury of emotional attachments. They didn't form bonds with aliens. They didn't mix their blood with the enemy. At least, that's what he told himself. Still, Ethan could feel the growing pull between them. It wasn't just a bond. It was a connection that transcended everything he had known. It was spiritual, emotional, physical. Every part of him seemed to vibrate with it. And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't deny it. One evening, as they rested in another hidden valley, Jaira turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I can feel your struggle, Ethan," she said softly. "But this bond, it is not something that can be forced. It is not something that can be ignored. It is a part of us, as much as the air we breathe, as much as our hearts beat." Ethan met her gaze, his own eyes filled with conflict. "I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with you." Jaira's expression softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. Her touch was warm, and Ethan felt a jolt of electricity shoot through his body at the contact. It wasn't just physical. It was the bond, growing stronger, reaching out to him, pulling him closer to her. "You don't have to do anything," Jaira said quietly. "Just let it happen. Let us see where it takes us, together." Ethan swallowed hard. It was the first time she had spoken so plainly, so honestly about the bond. And for the first time, Ethan realized something deep within himself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about escaping the war or completing his mission. It was about something more, something he had never allowed himself to believe in. It was about trust and acceptance and the strength they could find in each other. He had always been a man who kept his emotions in check, who kept his distance from others. But with Jaira, that distance was no longer possible. She had entered his life in a way he couldn't explain, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to anymore. "I'll try," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll try to accept it." Jaira smiled, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and relief. "That is all I ask, Ethan. Together, we will face whatever comes. We will face it as one." The connection had deepened, yes, but with that deepening came something else. A growing sense of belonging. Ethan's heart raced as he crouched low in the dense foliage, the sound of the enemy patrols growing louder with every passing second. His senses were on high alert. The blood-red sky above them cast an eerie glow over the alien landscape, and in the distance, he could hear the steady thrum of the enemy's engines. They were getting closer. The soldiers Ethan had fought against in countless battles had no mercy, and their presence here in this alien world was a constant threat to both him and Jaira. He looked to his side, where Jaira knelt beside him, her bright eyes scanning the horizon with the same sharp focus. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination. Despite everything they had been through, despite the pain and the dangers that had surrounded them, Jaira had never faltered. Her strength had become a beacon of hope for him, and in her, Ethan had begun to find a kind of peace, a peace he had never known before. The bond between them had grown even more intense over the past few weeks, and despite his initial reluctance, Ethan had begun to accept it. It was no longer just something he endured. It was something he could not imagine living without. The emotions that flowed between them were now intertwined in a way that felt natural, and it was as though they had become extensions of one another. But with that deep connection came a vulnerability Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. As the enemy patrols moved closer, Ethan's thoughts went back to the moment he had given Jaira his blood. He had never fully understood what that sacrifice had meant. All he knew was that he had done it because he couldn't stand the thought of losing her. Even when he barely knew her, he had given his blood to save her life. And in that moment, he had chosen her, without knowing that the consequences of that decision would change his life forever. Now, it seemed like the universe had a cruel way of balancing the scales. The sacrifice he had made would be returned to him in a way he hadn't expected. But before that could happen, there was a battle to fight. A battle that would require them both to make the hardest decision of their lives. As the ship ascended into the sky, Ethan felt the pull of the bond once again, stronger than ever. He could feel Jyra's presence, even though she was far away. The bond was still there, tying them together in a way that defied time and space. And in that moment, he knew Jyra's sacrifice had not been in vain. The connection between them, the bond they had formed, was stronger than any distance, stronger than any force that might try to tear them apart. They would be reunited. Somehow, someway, they would find each other again. Days passed as Ethan flew alone through the vast reaches of space, leaving the alien world behind. He had survived, but the victory felt empty. Jyra's sacrifice echoed in his heart, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the mission, her absence was a constant ache. He had made it to the ship, he had escaped, but in doing so, he had left behind the one person who had become everything to him. The one person who had given him something he never thought he'd have again: hope. The ship's engines hummed steadily around him as he sat in the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the stars outside. He could feel the isolation creeping in. For the first time in years, Ethan had felt what it was like to be connected to someone, not just through duty or camaraderie, but through something deeper, something more personal. The bond between him and Jyra had been forged in blood, but it was so much more than that. It was a lifeline, a promise. But now it was just a memory, and that was what hurt the most. Ethan tried to push the thoughts of Jyra aside, focusing on his next steps. He had to get back to Earth. He had to report to his superiors. There was still work to be done. But even as he told himself that, he knew it wasn't enough. The thought of returning to the familiar routine of military life without Jyra by his side seemed impossible. As the days passed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Jyra was still with him. It wasn't just the bond they shared. It wasn't just the lingering sense of her presence that seemed to fill the empty spaces of the ship. It was more than that. It was as though a part of her had traveled with him, a part of her that refused to let go. The bond between them hadn't been severed. It hadn't faded. In fact, it was growing stronger. At night, when the stars were the only things visible outside the small porthole, Ethan would sit in the dark, eyes closed, and listen. He could feel her there somewhere, reaching out to him. It was a sensation that couldn't be ignored, and though it both comforted and frightened him, he couldn't bring himself to sever the connection. Even when he tried to shut it out, the pull was too strong. He often found himself talking to her, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Not in the way people usually hear each other. It wasn't about speaking. It was about sharing the thoughts and feelings that flowed between them. "I'm sorry," Ethan would whisper into the quiet of the ship. "I should have stayed. I shouldn't have let you go alone. I should have been there." The bond would pulse in response. It wasn't a word, but it was enough. The connection was there. A reminder that no matter what, Jyra was still with him in a way no one else could be. And slowly that sense of comfort began to outweigh the pain of her absence. It was the early hours of the morning when something unexpected happened. The ship's navigation system alerted him to a disturbance ahead, an anomaly in space. Ethan had always been trained to trust his instincts, but even with his military training, he wasn't prepared for what came next. The ship's sensors began to react wildly, and before he could make sense of the readings, a massive force pulled the ship off course. The lights flickered, and a heavy tremor shook the vessel. Panic surged through him. His heart raced, and he fought to regain control, but the force was too strong. His fingers flew over the controls, trying to correct the trajectory, but nothing was working. In an instant, the ship was engulfed by a blinding light. Everything went silent. When Ethan opened his eyes, he wasn't in his ship anymore. The familiar hum of the engines was gone, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend where he was. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the sensation that everything around him had shifted, that he had crossed into a new space entirely. He looked around. The stars that had been so close before were now far away, dim and distant. The ship was gone. In its place, Ethan stood on a solid, rocky surface, an unfamiliar world, unlike anything he had ever seen. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he moved with his team through the labyrinthine hallways. His mind was sharp, focusing on each turn, every sound, every movement. It was like a dance. Each step, each shot, was part of a delicate rhythm, a carefully orchestrated plan. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a part of something bigger, a movement, a rebellion against an overwhelming force. The enemy had the technology, the power, and the numbers, but the humans had something they didn't: the will to fight, to survive, no matter the odds. The closer they got to the AI core, the more difficult it became to move through the ship's defenses. The walls themselves seemed to come alive, shifting and changing, as though the ship was actively trying to stop them. The team encountered more traps: pressure-sensitive floors that triggered laser beams, doors that slammed shut when they got too close, and energy fields that threatened to fry anyone who touched them. It felt as though the very ship itself was conspiring against them. But Ethan and his team pressed on, fighting through wave after wave of cybernetic soldiers and bypassing every defense the ship threw at them. They were running out of time. The countdown was ticking, and every second brought them closer to the end. As they neared the AI core, the tension in the air grew unbearable. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the hum of the AI grew louder, like a pulse that vibrated through their bones. Finally, they reached the core. It was even more magnificent and terrifying, up close. The glowing circuits and robotic arms twisted and turned, a surreal display of advanced technology. In the center, the AI's control system pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed through the room. This was it. This was the heart of the enemy. Ethan moved toward the control console, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He had the virus ready, a carefully crafted program that would overload the AI system, severing its control over the alien fleet. All they had to do was plant it and hope that it worked. But just as Ethan began the process, something unexpected happened. The AI adapted. In an instant, the holographic screens in the room shifted, revealing a new set of data. The virus they had planted was being countered. The AI had anticipated their move. It wasn't just defending itself. It was actively fighting back. Suddenly, the walls of the room buzzed to life, and the entire core chamber was filled with blinding light. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the air, and the countdown for the final assault on Earth began. The AI had initiated its own response, activating a self-defense mechanism that would allow the alien fleet to launch its final strike. "We don't have much time," General Bonner shouted. "We need to finish this now." Ethan's mind raced. They were so close, but now they had to face a new challenge. The AI wasn't just trying to stop them from planting the virus. It was actively countering every move they made. Ethan could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. This was it, the final confrontation. With the countdown ticking down, the team sprang into action, fighting off waves of AI-controlled soldiers as they desperately tried to finish the virus upload. The stakes had never been higher. Every moment counted, and the tension was unbearable. The fate of Earth and the entire human race hung in the balance. The countdown echoed in the ears of every soldier, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. The humans were so close now, so close to victory. But as Ethan Cole and General Bonner worked furiously to complete their mission, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. The fate of Earth rested in their hands, and the cost of failure would be unimaginable. The AI was no longer just an enemy. It was a cold, calculating force, its presence looming over them like a dark cloud, prepared to wipe out humanity with a single command. They had reached the heart of the alien mothership, the AI core. The virus was planted. The countdown was running, ticking down the final moments before the alien fleet would launch its final assault on Earth. The air was thick with tension. The walls of the core room hummed with energy, vibrating with the raw power of the AI. It knew they were there. It knew they were trying to destroy it. And it was fighting back with everything it had. The AI's defenses were relentless, but the humans were determined. General Bonner and his team fought back, battling cybernetic soldiers and AI-controlled drones that flooded the room with unrelenting force. Ethan was at the console, trying to upload the virus that would disrupt the AI's control over the fleet. His hands trembled as he worked, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They couldn't afford to fail. With a loud bang, the door to the core room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The AI had initiated its final defense mechanism. A wave of energy surged from the walls, knocking Bonner to the ground. Ethan looked up, panic rising in his chest. They had no more time. But Bonner wasn't finished. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself back up. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "Keep going, Ethan. We've come too far to quit now." The room shook with a powerful blast as another wave of energy crashed into the humans. The AI was desperately trying to protect itself, to ensure that its control over the alien fleet would not be disrupted. But it was too late. The virus was already in the system. The AI's defenses were collapsing, its control over the alien fleet weakening. The humans watched as the rogue ships in the alien fleet began to turn on each other. Without the AI's guidance, the once mighty armada of warships spiraled into chaos. Ships fired on each other, weapons discharging wildly as the once unified force descended into anarchy. For the first time, the humans saw hope, a flicker of light in the dark void of space. Ethan stared at the screen in front of him, watching the chaos unfold. His heart raced as he realized that they had done it. They had stopped the AI. But the victory was bittersweet. As the rogue ships destroyed each other, the alien fleet was crumbling. But Bonner lay on the ground, bloodied and bruised. Ethan rushed to his side, kneeling down beside him. "Bonner." "No," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. The general's eyes flickered open, a faint smile on his lips. "It was worth it, Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We saved Earth." Ethan's heart clenched with grief. He had lost so many friends in this war, but Bonner's death was the hardest blow. The man had led them through impossible odds, had shown them what it meant to fight for something greater than themselves. And now he was gone. But Bonner's sacrifice was not in vain. As the AI's control faltered and the fleet turned on itself, the humans had secured an impossible victory. The alien threat that had loomed over them for so long was no more. And in that moment, Ethan made a silent vow to honor Bonner's memory, to carry on the fight that he had started. The journey back to Earth was a somber one. The crew of the stealth cruiser was silent, their minds consumed with the loss of their leader, their friend. Ethan stared out the window, watching as the stars stretched out before him, endless and full of possibilities. He thought of all they had fought for: families, friends, and freedom. They had survived against all odds. They had won. But even as they approached Earth, safe at last, Ethan knew that this victory was only the beginning. The universe was vast, filled with dangers and challenges that no one could predict. They had defeated one enemy, but who knew what would come next? The Earth was safe, for now. But the battle for humanity's future was far from over. There would always be new threats, new challenges to face. But as Ethan looked out at the stars, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Humanity had faced its darkest hour and emerged victorious. And now it was time to explore the stars, to push beyond the limits of their world, and to forge a future that would honor the sacrifices made. "We may have won this war," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "But the universe will never stop testing us." He looked out at the stars, wondering what new challenges awaited them, and what new adventures lay ahead. But whatever the future held, he knew one thing for sure. Humanity would face it, just as they had faced the alien fleet, with courage, with determination, and most importantly, together. The journey had only just begun.